Hello there, fellow night owls, and welcome to tonight's gentle waltz back in time. Tonight we'll be diving into the fascinating but also tragic life of the medieval court jester. Before we begin our journey back in time, I'd love to know who I have the pleasure of storytelling to this evening. If you're feeling up to it, please leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you right now. Are you curled up in bed, ready to call it a night? Settling in for an afternoon nap? On a long journey, hoping to catch some shut-eye? Wherever you are and whatever time it may be, I'm honoured to be your companion as you unwind. If you enjoy mellow, meandering explorations of history like this one, I warmly invite you to subscribe to this podcast. We'll be embarking on many a drowsy voyage through the centuries, meeting colourful characters and pondering the great tapestry of human experience, all in the spirit of bringing you some restful entertainment. Tonight, we'll be venturing back to the Middle Ages, a time of grand castles, noble knights, and powerful monarchs ruling over feudal lands. But amidst all the pageantry and solemnity of the royal court, one figure stands out for his bright colours, his impudent wit, and his mysterious smile. He is the court jester, that mischievous entertainer tasked with amusing the king and his courtiers with jokes, songs, and clever antics. You can picture him now, a lithe acrobat in a motley patchwork of reds and greens and yellows, bells jingling merrily from the tips of his floppy hood. He prances and cavorts before the throne, a study in laughter and perpetual motion. His eyes sparkle with mirth above a knowing grin, as he delivers a sly quip that sets the whole court laughing. But as we'll soon discover, there is more to this mirthful character than meets the eye. Behind the jester's carefree exterior lies a poignant, often tragic story, one that illuminates the complex realities of life in a medieval royal court. The jester may play the fool, but his is a role rich in irony and contradiction. Through his tale, we'll encounter surprising truths about power and privilege, about the wisdom of fools and the foolishness of the wise. We'll see how laughter can disguise tears, and how even the lowliest individual can make their mark on history. So make yourself comfortable, dear listener, and let me spin for you the bittersweet ballad of the court jester. Our story begins centuries ago, in the royal courts of ancient lands. For as long as there have been kings and rulers, there have been those whose job it is to entertain them. In the palaces of pharaohs and emperors, fools and jesters crafted their arts of amusement, winning favour with their antics. The Egyptians had performers called danga who used mimicry and satire to divert the royal household. In ancient Rome, the emperor Gallienus gave a regular fool called Marullus a seat at his table, where he was free to joke and cavort. Even the Bible speaks of royal fools, as when King Achish accused David of playing the madman in my presence. But it was in the Middle Ages that the jester as we know him truly came into his own. In the courts of medieval Europe, troubadours and minstrels evolved into fools and jesters, their quick wits and bold antics easing the tedium of courtly life. From the 12th century on, no royal entourage was complete without an impudent entertainer. These medieval fools were more than just simple clowns or buffoons. Jesters were men of many talents, skilled in music, acrobatics, storytelling, and above all, in comedy. A quick tongue and a ready joke were the jester's stock in trade. With a nimble wit, he could transform any situation into an opportunity for laughter. But the path of a jester was always a precarious one. To amuse a king was to walk a tightrope, balanced between mirth and mockery. One false step, one joke too far, and the fool could tumble from grace. In a society rigidly structured by rank and title, the jester occupied a unique position. He was often of low birth, yet his wit gave him a privileged place at the royal table. He might rub shoulders with princes and dukes, yet he remained always an outsider, set apart by his gaudy costume and eccentric ways. This was the paradox of the Jester, at once insider and outsider, confidant and scapegoat. His was a delicate dance indeed, as we shall see in the tales to come. But first, let us examine more closely the way of the fool, the craft and traditions of this most peculiar of callings. Picture, if you will, a typical royal feast in a great medieval hall. Long wooden tables groan under the weight of sumptuous dishes. Nobles and ladies glitter in silks and jewels as servants scurry to and fro with flagons of mead and wine. At the head of the hall, on a raised dais, the king and queen preside in all their splendor. And then, with a clatter of bells and a raucous cry, in bounds the Jester to work his merriment. All eyes turn to this curious figure in his trademark motley. From head to toe he is a riot of colour, a patchwork of bold hues, red and yellow and green, topped by a hood decorated with donkey's ears or the comb of a rooster. Around his neck and at his wrists and ankles, bells jingle with every caper and spring. Sometimes he carries a prop, a mock scepter or a pig's bladder on a stick. His very appearance proclaims him a man apart, a licensed transgressor of the normal social code. Now watch as he goes to work, this master of foolery. Perhaps he'll start with a somersault or a handstand, drawing applause for his acrobatic skill. Then some juggling to further warm the crowd. Balls and clubs and fruit whirling in dizzying arcs. But it's the Jester's tongue, not his limbs, that are his true feat of dexterity. He'll launch into a barrage of jokes and puns, spinning outrageous stories, hurling good-natured insults. Sacred cows are his favourite target. He'll parody the church and the aristocracy, poke fun at current events and local scandals. Nothing is off limits for this voice of mischief, except, of course, directing his barbs too pointedly at the king himself. That way lies the dungeons, or worse. The Jester must play his cheekiest jests on safer targets, using his wit to slyly comment on the foibles of those a rung or two below the royal level. Perhaps he'll engage in mock flirtation with the ladies at court, his audacity drawing giggles behind fans. Or maybe he'll play at riddling with a knight, frustrating the poor man with his nimble nonsense. Whatever his antics, the Jester's goal is always to amuse, to transport the court to a world of whimsy and delight beyond the everyday. It was no easy task, this business of professional fooling. Jesters had to be jacks of all trades, masters of a dozen skills beyond mere joking. A fine singing voice was an asset, as jesters were often expected to perform the latest ditties and ballads. Skill at an instrument or two also helped. Jesters might play the vielle or pipe to accompany their songs and stories. Dancing, miming, sleight of hand, all were tools in the Jester's kit of tricks. The more varied his abilities, the better his chance of tickling the royal funny bone. But the Jester's most essential talent was his silver tongue. In an age when most people were illiterate, the Jester was prized as an entertainer who could spin stories and clever turns of phrase. Many were poets in their own right, authors of ditties and rhymes that have come down to us through the centuries. Take, for example, the English jester John Scogan, who served the courts of Edward IV and Henry VII in the 15th century. Scogan was renowned for his quick wit and his way with words. In one famous incident, he was asked by Queen Elizabeth Woodville to compose a poem on a lady's hair that resembled a beard. Without missing a beat, Scogan rattled off this rhyme. Her face is fair, her beard is brown, a marvel sure to make men frown. But yet in sooth it is no beard, it is a mask for to be feared. With verbal gems like these, jesters won fame and favour in their day. But as we'll see, not every fool fared so well in the tricky business of royal humour. For every Scogan celebrated for his cleverness, there was a jester like poor Tom Skelton. Skelton served in the Tudor court of Henry VIII, a monarch notorious for his hot temper and changeable moods. According to one story, Skelton once displeased the king with an ill-timed jest. In a fury, Henry ordered his fool to be executed. As he was dragged away to his doom, Skelton cried out, "I leave all my goods to the next fool that will take my place." The dark quip apparently touched the king's own morbid wit, and he was moved to pardon Skelton on the spot. Such was the razor's edge on which a jester danced. But perhaps no figure better illustrates the pitfalls of the jester's trade than Archibald Armstrong, a Scottish fool who served both James I and Charles I of England. Armstrong, known as Archie to the court, was renowned for his bold jests that spared no one's dignity. Once, when the Archbishop of Canterbury complained that Archie had insulted him, Charles the Son replied, "I believe you, Archie, for he speaks truth of all men." But Archie's loose tongue eventually got the better of him. In 1637, during a tense confrontation between King Charles and his treasurer, Archie made the mistake of cracking jokes. The king, unamused, had Archie stripped of his motley and permanently banished from court. The once celebrated jester ended his days in poverty and disgrace. Stories like these hint at the darker side of the jester's life, the perils that lay beneath the surface of his jolly exterior. For all his privileges and fame, the jester walked a precarious path. He might play the merry fool, but his was often a poignant, even tragic lot. In the next chapter, we'll delve deeper into the pathos behind the jester's smile. We'll explore how, for many fools, the motley was a mask for a life of hardship and heartbreak. The archetype of the sad clown was more than mere artistic fancy. It was the stark reality for many a medieval jester. So settle yourself more cozily into your pillow, dear listener, and let us peer behind the jester's jolly facade. His story has more to teach us yet. To be continued. As the sun sets over the castle walls and the bustle of the royal court fades into the evening, let us delve deeper into the vibrant yet precarious world of the medieval jester. These enigmatic figures, with their quirky costumes and quick wits, walked a tightrope between amusement and offence, forever dependent on the whims and fancies of their royal masters. The life of a court jester was a paradoxical one, simultaneously privileged and vulnerable, celebrated and scorned. On one hand, they enjoyed a rare freedom of speech and access to the highest echelons of power. With their clever wordplay and cunning jests, they could speak truth to authority in ways no other courtier dared. A well-timed quip from a shrewd jester could influence a king's decision or sway the court's opinion. Take, for instance, the renowned French jester Triboulet, who served under both Kings Louis XII and Francis I in the early 16th century. Triboulet was known for his sharp tongue and audacious witticisms, often brazenly mocking the nobility and even the monarch himself. Once, when King Francis threatened to execute Triboulet for his impudence, the jester cleverly retorted, "Ah, but you wouldn't execute me without first giving me time to regret having offended you." The king, amused by Triboulet's quick thinking, granted him a stay of execution. In this way, the jester's wit served as both a weapon and a shield, allowing him to challenge authority, while also protecting himself from its wrath. Yet for all their influence and fame, jesters led a precarious existence, forever at the mercy of their patrons' moods and whims. A jester who failed to amuse, or who overstepped the bounds of propriety, could quickly fall from grace. The 16th century English jester, Will Somers, learned this lesson the hard way when he dared to criticise King Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn. Though Somers had long enjoyed the king's favour, his boldness in this matter led to his banishment from court. The incident serves as a stark reminder of the jester's ultimately powerless position. No matter how beloved, they were still mere entertainers, easily discarded when they no longer served their purpose. This expendability was compounded by the fact that many jesters came from marginalized backgrounds. They were often individuals with physical deformities, mental disabilities, or simply those from the lowest rungs of society. For these outcasts, the role of court jester was one of the few paths to a measure of security and status. Yet this security was always tenuous, contingent on their ability to constantly amuse and perform. The story of Geoffrey Hudson, a dwarf jester in the court of Queen Henrietta Maria in the 17th century, epitomizes the cruelty and capriciousness that could characterize a jester's life. Hudson, who stood just 18 inches tall, was presented to the Queen as a gift, hidden inside a large pie from which he emerged to the delight and amusement of the court. For years, Hudson served as a loyal companion to the Queen, accompanying her on trips and even fighting in the English Civil War. Yet when he fell out of favour later in life, Hudson was cast aside, dying in poverty and obscurity. His tale is a poignant reminder of the jester's ultimate lack of agency. No matter how beloved or successful, they were still at the whim of the court, mere playthings to be discarded when the novelty wore off. It is this fundamental tension between influence and impotence, fame and expendability, that defines the bittersweet legacy of the court jester. These complex figures, at once central and marginalized, embodied the contradictions and cruelties of the medieval world they inhabited. In their wit and wordplay, their physical antics and daring jests, jesters served as a vital release valve for a rigidly hierarchical society, allowing for a sanctioned space of subversion and satire. Yet this role came at a steep personal cost, forever marking the jester as an outsider, a perpetual other. As we drift deeper into the realm of sleep, let us ponder the profound paradoxes of the jester's life. At once merry and melancholic, celebrated and scorned, powerful and powerless. In their haunting history, we may catch a glimpse of the human condition itself, forever striving for meaning and mirth in the face of life's cruelties and absurdities. So let us raise a glass to the poignant punchline that was the medieval court jester, a figure of laughter and tears, forever etched in the annals of history. But the story of the court jester is not merely one of individuals. It is also a tale of archetypes and symbolism, of the deeper psychological roles these figures played in the collective imagination of medieval society. In many ways, the jester served as a kind of inverted mirror, reflecting back to the court a distorted image of itself. Through their antics and mockery, jesters exposed the follies and vices of those in power, using laughter as a subversive tool to challenge the status quo. This notion of the jester as a truth-teller, a wise fool who uses wit to expose hypocrisy and absurdity, has deep roots in Western culture. We see it in the biting satire of Shakespeare's fools, in the philosophical musings of Erasmus's In Praise of Folly, and in the subversive comedy of modern-day stand-up comedians. In each case, the fool serves as a necessary counterpoint to power, using humor to speak truth to authority and to reveal the fundamental human foibles that unite us all. Yet the jester is more than just a satirist or a truth-teller. He is also a deeply ambiguous figure, one who embodies the very contradictions he mocks. In his motley garb and his position at the margins of society, the jester is a walking paradox. At once a part of the court and yet always outside of it. He is a man who makes his living by playing the fool, yet whose foolishness often conceals a deep wisdom and insight. This ambiguity is perhaps best embodied in the famous Shakespearean fool, Feste from Twelfth Night. Throughout the play, Feste moves seamlessly between the realms of high and low, court and countryside, using his wit and wordplay to expose the follies of those around him. Yet Feste is more than just a jester. He is also a melancholic figure, one who recognizes the fundamental sadness and transience of the human condition. As he sings, in the play's final scene, "For the rain, it raineth every day." It is this combination of wisdom and melancholy, of laughter and tears, that perhaps best captures the essence of the court jester. For in their brief, shining moments upon the stage of history, these figures embodied the full spectrum of human experience, the joy and the sorrow, the triumph and the tragedy. And in doing so, they left behind a legacy that continues to resonate down through the ages, reminding us of the enduring power of wit, of truth, and of the indomitable human spirit. As we let the jester's tale carry us deeper into the realm of dreams, let us take a moment to contemplate the profound lessons their lives can teach us. In a world that often seems too rigid, too hierarchical, too serious, the jester reminds us of the importance of laughter, of the need to puncture pomposity and to speak truth to power. They remind us that even in the darkest of times, humor and humanity can still shine through. So let us honor the memory of these complex, contradictory, utterly fascinating figures. Let us remember the great jesters of history, the Triboules and the Will Somerses, the Geoffrey Hudsons and the Festies. But let us also remember the countless nameless fools who lived and died in the courts of kings and queens, who used their wit and their courage to make the world a little brighter, a little more bearable. And as we finally drift off into the welcoming embrace of sleep, let us carry with us the jester's enduring spirit, the spirit of laughter in the face of adversity, of truth in the face of power, of hope in the face of an often dark and difficult world. For in the end, perhaps that is the greatest legacy of the court jester. The reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit endures, forever resilient, forever hopeful, forever laughing in the face of the abyss. As the sun set over the stone turrets of the royal castle, a hush fell over the bustling court. Servants scurried to light torches in the great hall, casting flickering shadows on the tapestried walls. Amid the gaggle of courtiers in sumptuous silks and velvets, a solitary figure stood out. The court jester, a splash of bright motley against the sea of muted finery. Perched upon his head was a floppy hat adorned with donkey ears and tinkling silver bells that chimed softly as he moved. The jester cut a curious figure, at once central to the court, yet also apart from it. His very presence seemed to promise levity, a respite from the weight of courtly responsibilities and intrigues. As nobles chattered and jockeyed for royal favour, the jester remained still, his painted face an inscrutable mask. Only his darting eyes gave a hint of the keen mind behind the foolish facade, ever watchful for the perfect moment, to interject with a well-timed quip or a cutting barb. For this was the essence of the jester's role: to amuse and entertain, certainly, but also to observe, to poke holes in pomposity, and to speak the truth that others dared not voice. In a world rigidly stratified by class and protocol, the jester was an oddity, a wild card who could upset the established order with a clever turn of phrase or a biting joke. But for all his wit and audacity, the life of a court jester was far from easy. Behind the merry jingles and japers lurked a darker reality, one of precarity, isolation, and even tragedy. Jesters might enjoy a certain license to mock and cavort, but they were still beholden to the whims of their royal masters. A quip that went too far, a joke that fell flat, or simply a shift in the political winds could spell disaster for even the most talented fool. To understand the jester's paradoxical position, we must first delve into the murky origins of this unique profession. The tradition of the court fool stretches back to ancient times, with records of jesters and clowns entertaining royal households in Egypt, Greece, and Rome. But it was in the Middle Ages that the jester truly came into his own, becoming a staple of courts across Europe. In a time when most people lived hard, short lives dictated by the rhythms of agriculture and the edicts of the church, the medieval court was a world apart. Here, Nobles and royalty whiled away their days in a never-ending round of feasts, hunts, and tournaments. Amid all this grandeur and excess, the jester served as a kind of pressure valve, deflating pomposity and providing a much-needed dose of irreverence. But the role of the jester was not merely to amuse. In a society where speaking truth to power could be a dangerous game, the jester's foolishness served as a shield, allowing him to voice criticisms and observations that others dared not express. A skilled jester could use his wit to influence policy, to challenge authority, and even to speak for the voiceless masses beyond the castle walls. Of course, this was a delicate balancing act. Push too far, and a jester might find himself out of favour, or worse. Many jesters came from difficult backgrounds. Some were born with physical deformities or mental impairments. Others came from poverty or had fallen on hard times. For these individuals, the role of court fool offered a rare chance at security and status, but it was a precarious existence nonetheless. Consider the tale of Geoffrey Hudson, a dwarf jester in the court of King Charles I of England. Hudson's diminutive stature made him a novelty, and he was treated more like a pet than a person. In one infamous incident, the Queen's courtiers thought it would be amusing to serve Hudson in a large pie, from which he would then leap out to surprise the guests. For Hudson, it was a humiliating ordeal, a stark reminder of his lack of agency and autonomy. As the night wore on and the revels reached their peak, the jester remained in the great hall, weaving between the increasingly raucous nobles with the nimbleness of a cat. His bells jingled merrily, but his eyes were watchful, his smile fixed, for he knew all too well the precariousness of his position, the razor's edge upon which he danced. A misstep, a miscalculation, and he could easily find himself cast out of the warmth and light of the court, left to fend for himself in a world that had little use for a fool without a patron. It was a fate that had befallen many a jester over the centuries. Some, like Hudson, simply outlived their usefulness, their novelty wearing thin as they aged. Others fell victim to the capricious nature of court politics, caught up in intrigues and power struggles that they could not hope to navigate. Still others found themselves on the wrong side of a joke, their wit turned against them in a moment of royal displeasure. But for all the dangers and indignities of the jester's life, there was also a certain power in the role. A truly skilled fool could use his wits to shape the course of events, to plant seeds of doubt or inspiration in the minds of those who held the reins of power. In a world where literacy was rare and books were scarce, the jester's quick tongue and ready repartee could be as potent a weapon as any sword or quill. Take the example of Will Somers, the beloved jester of King Henry VIII. Somers was known for his biting wit and his willingness to speak truth to power, even in the face of the king's notorious temper. On one occasion, when Henry was considering executing a group of Catholic rebels, Somers reportedly quipped, "The Lord have mercy on your soul, for your body is surely in danger." It was a bold statement, one that could have easily earned Somers a trip to the Tower. But coming from the mouth of the fool, it was taken as a jest, a bit of gallows humour that nonetheless gave the king pause. In this way, the jester could serve as a kind of moral compass for the court, a voice of conscience in a world often consumed by greed, ambition, and the ruthless pursuit of power. Of course, not all jesters were as bold or as principled as Somers. Some were content to play the sycophant, to flatter and fawn in the hopes of currying favour. But the best and most enduring jesters were those who walked the line between mirth and meaning, who used their foolishness as a cloak for wisdom. This is perhaps best exemplified by the legend of Triboulet, the sharp-tongued jester of King Francis I of France. According to the stories, Triboulet was once asked by the king what punishment should be meted out to a nobleman who had offended him. Without missing a beat, Triboulet replied, I think he should be sent away to get an education, for he'll never learn anything by remaining in your court." It was a sly dig at the king's own lack of learning, as well as a commentary on the stultifying atmosphere of the royal court. In one fell swoop, Triboulet had both amused and admonished his master, all while maintaining the guise of the fool. But for all their cleverness and insight, jesters were still very much products of their time and place. They were not revolutionaries or social reformers, at least not in any overt sense. Rather, they served a more subtle and psychologically complex role, one that speaks to the deeper tensions and contradictions of the human condition. In many ways, the figure of the court jester represents the inversion of the normal social order, a world turned upside down. In a society rigidly stratified by class and station, the jester was a walking contradiction, a lowly figure who could nonetheless speak with impunity to the highest in the land. His very existence was a kind of challenge to the status quo, a reminder that beneath the pomp and pageantry of court life, all men were ultimately equal in the eyes of God and the grim spectre of death. At the same time, the jester also served as a kind of safety valve for the tensions and frustrations that inevitably build up in any hierarchical society. By giving voice to the unspoken truths and uncomfortable realities of court life, the jester provided a release, a way for the powerful to confront their own foibles and failings without losing face. In this sense, the fool was not so much a subversive figure as a necessary one, a critical component in the delicate balance of power that held the court together. This is not to say that the life of a jester was an easy or enviable one. For all their wit and wisdom, jesters were still very much at the mercy of their patrons, their fate tied to the whims and fortunes of the court. A jester who fell out of favour could easily find himself cast aside, left to fend for himself in a world that had little use for a fool without a stage. And even for those who managed to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics, the life of a jester was often a lonely and isolating one. Set apart by their unique role and status, jesters often struggled to form lasting bonds or relationships. They were, in a sense, perpetual outsiders, forever doomed to observe and comment on the foibles of their betters from the sidelines of life. As the night wore on and the revels reached their fever pitch, the jester could feel the weight of this isolation settling upon his shoulders like a heavy cloak. He watched as the nobles danced and drank, their laughter ringing hollow in his ears. For all his quick wit and clever jests, he knew that he would never truly be one of them, never fully accepted into their glittering world. And yet, there was a certain power in this outsider status as well. Free from the constraints of social norms and expectations, the jester was at liberty to speak his mind, to poke and prod at the pretensions of his betters with impunity. In a world of stifling conformity and rigid protocol, the fool's motley was a badge of freedom, a sign of his ability to transgress boundaries and challenge authority. But as the first light of dawn began to filter through the high windows of the great hall, the jester knew that his time was drawing to a close. The revels were winding down, the nobles staggering off to their beds in a haze of wine and exhaustion. Soon, the great hall would be empty, the jester's laughter fading into silence. For a moment, he allowed himself to linger, to savour the fading warmth of the dying embers in the great hearth. He thought of the countless jesters who had come before him, the fools and misfits who had danced and jested in the flickering firelight of courts long since turned to dust. In their own way, each had left a mark, a fleeting impression on the tapestry of history. And now, it was his turn, his brief moment in the sun. He knew that his days were numbered, that the changing times and the fickle winds of fate would soon conspire to render his profession obsolete. Already, the court was changing, the old ways giving way to new ideas and new forms of entertainment. The age of the jester was drawing to a close, and with it, a way of life that had endured for centuries. But for now, at least, the Jester still had a role to play, a duty to fulfill. With a sigh, he gathered up his bells and baubles, straightened his motley, and prepared to face another day. For though the life of a jester was often a tragic one, it was also a noble calling, a chance to bring a glimmer of light and laughter into a world too often shrouded in darkness. As he stepped out into the chill morning air, the jester could not help but wonder what the future would hold. Would he end his days like poor Geoffrey Hudson, cast aside and forgotten by a court that had once adored him? Or would he be remembered like Will Sommers, a voice of truth and conscience in a world too often consumed by falsehood and deceit? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain, for as long as there were courts and kings, there would always be a need for jesters, for those brave and foolish souls who dared to speak truth to power, to hold up a mirror to the follies and foibles of the mighty. And in that small way, perhaps the jester's life was not so tragic after all, but rather a testament to the enduring power of laughter, of hope, and of the indomitable human spirit. As the jester disappeared into the mists of morning, his bells jingling softly in the stillness, one could almost imagine the ghosts of jesters past walking beside him, a motley procession stretching back through the centuries. Each had played their part, had danced and jested and spoke truth to power in their own small way. And in doing so, they had left a legacy, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always room for a little foolishness, a little laughter, a little light. So let us remember the jesters, those tragic, comic figures who dared to stand apart, to speak truth to power, and to hold up a mirror to the world. In their own way, they were heroes, brave souls who risked everything for the sake of a laugh, a moment of levity in a too often solemn world. And though their names may be lost to history, their spirit lives on, a testament to the enduring power of wit, of courage, and of the unquenchable human thirst for joy in the face of adversity. As the sun rises over the sleeping castle, we bid farewell to the jester, that enigmatic figure who has danced and jested his way through our tale. His story is a reminder of the complexities of the human experience, of the ways in which even the lowliest among us can leave a mark on the world. And though his own life may have been marked by tragedy and sorrow, his legacy is one of laughter, of light, and of the unquenchable resilience of the human spirit. So let us take a moment to remember the jesters, to honor their courage and their wit, and to carry forward their spirit into our own lives. For in a world too often consumed by darkness and despair, we could all use a little more foolishness, a little more laughter, a little more light. And in that way, perhaps we can all be jesters in our own small way, bravely speaking truth to power and bringing joy to a world that so desperately needs it. As the sun set over the castle walls, casting long shadows across the courtyard, the weary jester trudged back to his modest quarters. He removed his colourful motley, the fabric now damp with sweat from a long day of tumbling and jesting. The bells on his cap jingled softly as he laid it down, the sound echoing the distant laughter of the nobles still ringing in his ears. For all the merriment he brought to the court, the jester's own life was often far from merry. Many jesters came from difficult backgrounds, born into poverty, or burdened with physical deformities that made them objects of ridicule. For these social outcasts, donning the fool's motley was a way to turn their disadvantages into a sort of armour. By embodying the role of the fool, they could deflect the cruelty of others and find a place for themselves in the rigid hierarchy of the court. But that place was always a precarious one, dependent on the whims and favour of the monarch they served. Jesters were, in essence, royal property, a human plaything to be discarded when the novelty wore off. The jester's life was one of constant insecurity, where even the most skilled and clever fool could quickly fall from grace. One of the most striking examples of this cruel expendability is the story of Geoffrey Hudson, a dwarf jester in the court of England's King Charles I. Born in 1619 to a poor butcher, Hudson's small stature marked him as different from birth. When he was just 7 years old, the Duke of Buckingham discovered Hudson and decided to make him part of an elaborate entertainment for the King and Queen. The Duke had the tiny Hudson smuggled into a large pie, from which he leapt out, much to the surprise and amusement of the royal audience. The Queen was so delighted by the little jester that she took him into her service, and Hudson became a fixture of the court, entertaining nobles with his wit, dancing and riding skill despite his size. But Hudson's life took a dark turn during the English Civil War. A staunch royalist, he was captured and imprisoned by parliamentary forces. During his captivity, Hudson was mockingly paraded through the streets in an iron cage, a sad echo of the pie from which he had once sprung. Though he eventually regained his freedom, Hudson never fully recovered from this degradation. He died in poverty, a broken man, his clever quips and capering now a distant memory. Hudson's tragic tale illustrates the fundamental vulnerability of the court jester. No matter how much they were prized for their wit and humour, jesters were always at the mercy of the powerful elites they served. In a society defined by rigid class hierarchies, the jester's status was always ambiguous. They might enjoy a degree of intimacy and influence with their royal patrons, but they were never truly equals. At the end of the day, a jester was still a servant, a piece of property to be used and discarded at will. This precarity was compounded by the fact that jesters often dared to speak truth to power, using their wit and humour to subtly, or not so subtly, critique the actions of their masters. A clever fool could wield his jokes as a weapon, puncturing the pretensions of the powerful and exposing hypocrisy. But this was always a risky game. A jester who overstepped his bounds might quickly find himself out of favour, or worse. One of the most famous examples of a jester who dared to challenge his king was Will Somers, the beloved fool of Henry VIII. Somers was renowned for his quick wit and his ability to use humour to deflate the king's notorious temper. In one famous incident, Somers is said to have found the king brooding angrily over a perceived slight. The jester approached the monarch and, bowing low, declared, "I can tell you something that will make you laugh and grow fat." When the king demanded to know what this was, Somers replied, "It is the sight of all your noble subjects and servants becoming lean and thin from not having what is owed them. There are so many unpaid bills in your court that soon none of us will have the strength to laugh, except perhaps at our own misfortune." The king, suddenly seeing the absurdity of his own anger in the face of his jester's cheek, burst out laughing, and his ill temper vanished. With a few clever words, Somers had not only lifted the king's dark mood, but subtly reminded him of his responsibilities as a ruler. But not every jester was as lucky as Somers in speaking truth to power. In France, the jester Triboulet dared to openly mock King Francis I, a feat of shocking impudence in a time when kings were seen as divinely appointed rulers. Furious at this insult to his dignity, Francis threatened to have Triboulet executed. The quick-witted fool responded with a challenge. "Ah, but I defy you to kill me in a way that I have not already imagined." Intrigued, the king asked Triboulet how he would imagine his own death, and the jester quipped, "By old age." The king, amused despite himself at Triboulet's clever response, laughed and let the jester live. The story, while possibly apocryphal, speaks to the way jesters could use their wits to navigate the dangerous currents of court politics and deflect the wrath of the powerful. But not every jester was as quick or lucky as Triboulet, and even the cleverest fool was always in a precarious position, dependent on his ability to amuse and flatter his master. The unequal power dynamic meant that a jester could never truly relax. He was always on. always performing for an audience that could turn against him at any moment. This constant pressure took its toll, both physically and mentally. The jester's antics, the tumbling, the dancing, the acrobatics, were demanding, and many fools suffered injuries or chronic pain as a result of their exertions. The famous Italian jester, Gonella, for instance, is said to have suffered a hernia from the strain of constantly contorting his body to amuse his patrons. But perhaps even more taxing was the mental strain of the jester's life. Behind the laughter and merriment, many jesters grappled with the same human sorrows and struggles as any man. But they were afforded little privacy or dignity. Their personal lives played out in the public eye for the amusement of their betters. The jester's motley, in the end, was both a blessing and a curse. It allowed men like Geoffrey Hudson or Will Summers to rise above their humble origins and rub shoulders with kings and queens. But it also marked them as different, as something not quite human, a source of laughter and entertainment rather than a fully realized person with hopes, dreams, and sorrows of their own. As night fell over the castle, the jester lay in his hard, narrow bed, aching from the day's exertions. In the gathering darkness, he could drop the grinning mask he wore for the court, his painted smile giving way to a weary frown. For a few precious hours, he could be simply a man, not a fool, not a freak, not a source of amusement, but a human being, as flawed and fragile as any other. In the morning, he would don his motley once more, the bright colours a shield against the cruelties and indignities of his life. He would smile and laugh and tumble, playing the part that had been assigned to him. But for now, in the quiet of his own chamber, the jester could let the mask slip and be, for a moment, simply himself. A small, sad figure curled in the darkness, dreaming perhaps of a life he might never know, where he was valued not for his foolishness, but for his humanity. The sun would rise as it always did, and the jester would face another day of laughter and sorrow, of mirth and misfortune. It was the fate of the fool to dance forever on the knife's edge between humour and heartbreak, a fate that would be echoed down through the centuries, in the lives of countless men and women who donned the motley and laughed in the face of their own tragedies. From the shadows of history, the jester's bells still seem to echo, a ghostly tinkling that speaks of the timeless human need for laughter in the face of sorrow, for hope in the depths of despair. In the end, perhaps that is the true legacy of the court jester, not the specific quips or antics recorded in the margins of historical records, but the enduring resilience of the human spirit, the ability to find humour and humanity in even the darkest of circumstances. So let us spare a thought as we drift off to sleep, for the weary jester alone in his chamber, the laughter of the court still ringing in his ears. Let us remember the men and women who donned the motley and danced on the edge of disaster, all for the fleeting reward of a monarch's smile. And let us carry with us the jester's enduring lesson, that even in the face of life's cruelties and injustices, we all have the power to laugh, to hope, and to find the strength to face another day. As the night deepens and the jester's story fades into the realm of dreams, we are reminded of the common humanity that binds us all across the centuries. In the end, are we not all, in some sense, jesters, dancing and tumbling through life's challenges, wearing our own form of motley to face the world? The story of the court jester may be a story of sorrow and struggle, but it is also a story of resilience, of the indomitable nature of the human spirit. And so, we bid good night to the jester and to all those who have laughed in the face of adversity. May their courage and wit inspire us as we navigate the winding paths of our own lives. And may we always remember, even in our darkest hours, the power of a smile a laugh. A moment of pure, unbridled joy in the face of all that life may throw at us. The Jester's tale is a reminder that even in the bleakest of circumstances, there is always room for hope, for laughter, for the indomitable resilience of the human spirit. It is a lesson as timeless as the stars that twinkle above the castle walls, a truth as eternal as the turning of the seasons. And so, as we slip into the realm of dreams, let us carry with us the Jester's enduring message that no matter how dark the night may seem, the dawn will always come, and with it, the chance to laugh, to love, and to begin anew. Good night, sweet fool, and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest. As the sun set over the castle walls, the great hall filled with the flickering light of candelabras and torches, the air was thick with the aroma of roasted meats and the chatter of nobles and courtiers. Minstrels played softly in a corner, while servants scurried to and fro with platters of food and drink. It was a scene of revelry and merriment, a nightly ritual of feasting and entertainment that played out in royal courts across medieval Europe. Amidst all the finery and pageantry, one figure stood out from the rest, the court jester. Clad in a motley coat of bright colours, with bells jingling from his floppy hat, he darted between the tables, cracking jokes, performing acrobatic stunts, and levelling playful jabs at the assembled nobles. The jester was a whirling dervish of energy and wit, a mischievous sprite whose antics brought laughter and levity to the stodgy formality of court life. But beneath the jester's painted smile and madcap exterior, there often lurked a deeper story, one of tragedy, heartbreak, and the peculiar predicament of the professional fool. For the medieval court jester, life was a tightrope walk between the privileges of being a royal favourite and the precarity of existing at the whims of the powerful. The roots of the jester's trade stretch back to ancient times. In the courts of the Egyptian pharaohs, sacred clowns perform burlesque dances to honour the gods. The ancient Greeks and Romans delighted in the antics of fools and buffoons who provided a subversive counterpoint to the solemnity of official culture. But it was in the Middle Ages that the court jester truly came into his own as a fixture of courtly life. In a strictly hierarchical society where birth and rank determined one's place, the jester occupied a unique position. He was often of low or ignoble birth, yet his wit and audacity granted him access to the highest echelons of power. In a world where deference and decorum were the order of the day, the fool was granted license to speak truth to power, to puncture the pretensions of the mighty with his barbed jests. But this was a double-edged sword, for the jester's favour was always precarious. He relied entirely on his ability to amuse and entertain his fickle patrons. A well-landed jest could earn him rich rewards, but a single misstep could spell disaster. Many a jester found himself cast out of court, or worse, for overstepping the bounds of his role. One such jester was Geoffrey Hudson, a dwarf who served in the court of Queen Henrietta Maria of England in the 17th century. Hudson's diminutive size was a source of fascination and amusement for the court, and he was initially treated as a sort of living curiosity. In a famous incident, he was served to the Queen in a large pie, emerging to the delight and astonishment of the guests. But as amusing as such spectacles may have been for the court, they underscore the lack of agency and dignity afforded to those in the jester's position. Hudson was a human being, not a prop or a plaything, yet his worth was measured solely by his ability to entertain. His small stature was a double curse, granting him access to the privileged world of the court, while also making him an object of ridicule and exploitation. Nor was Hudson alone in this plight. Many jesters came from difficult backgrounds marked by poverty, disability, or social stigma. For these individuals, the role of court fool offered a rare opportunity for social advancement and security. But it came at a steep price, for the jester was always at the mercy of his patron's whims and favour. Even those jesters who enjoyed a degree of fame and influence were never entirely secure in their positions. Take the case of Will Somers, the renowned jester of King Henry VIII of England. Somers was known for his quick wit and his ability to use humour to diffuse tense situations. He was even said to be one of the few people who could get away with openly criticising the notoriously temperamental king. But even Somers knew that his favour could be fleeting. He once quipped to the king, "I can tell you what you are thinking, my lord. You are thinking that if I were wiser, I would be richer, and if you were wiser, I would be richer too." It was a characteristically bold jest, but one that underscored the precarious nature of the jester's position. No matter how valued he might be in the moment, the fool was always expendable in the end. This expendability was a constant threat hanging over the heads of even the most successful jesters. In the cutthroat world of court politics, where fortunes could shift on a dime, the jester's livelihood depended on his ability to stay one step ahead of the whims of the powerful. A single misstep, a joke taken the wrong way, could spell the end of a jester's career, or worse. This was the fate that befell the French jester Triboulet, who served in the court of King Francis I in the 16th century. Triboulet was renowned for his wit and his fearlessness in speaking truth to power. He once famously declared to the king, "Nature made you a fool, but you have made yourself a king." It was a bold statement, even for a jester, and one that would come back to haunt him. For all his wit and audacity, Triboulet was not immune to the perils of court life. He found himself on the wrong side of a political intrigue and was banished from court. Without the protection of his royal patron, he soon fell into poverty and obscurity. It was a stark reminder of the precarity of the jester's existence, even for one as talented and famous as Triboulet. But for all the hardships and indignities they endured, jesters could also wield a surprising amount of influence in the rarefied world of the court. Their wit and satirical barbs could be used to comment on current events, to challenge the pretensions of the powerful, and even to shape the course of history. Consider the case of Archibald Armstrong, jester to King James I and King Charles I of England in the early 17th century. Armstrong was known for his acerbic wit and his willingness to speak truth to power, even at the risk of offending his royal patrons. During the English Civil War, he used his platform to criticise the excesses of both the royalist and parliamentarian factions, earning him a reputation as a satirical commentator on the tumultuous events of his time. Armstrong's jests could be biting, but they often contained a kernel of truth that cut through the noise of political rhetoric. In one famous exchange, he was asked by King Charles why he wasn't wearing the traditional motley of the jester. Armstrong reportedly replied, "Because all your Majesty's courtiers have taken up my trade and made me a gentleman." It was a clever jab at the sycophancy and self-interest of the courtiers, but it also spoke to the deeper role of the jester as a truth-teller and a check on the abuses of power. In a world where flattery and dissembling were the norm, the jester's foolishness could be a disarming form of wisdom, a way of speaking uncomfortable truths that others dared not utter. This subversive potential of the jester was not lost on those in power. In many ways, the licensed foolishness of the jester served as a safety valve, a way of releasing social tensions and anxieties in a controlled setting. By giving voice to the unspoken and the taboo, the jester could help to defuse potential challenges to the established order. At the same time, the jester's antics could also serve to reinforce the status quo by making light of the very real injustices and inequalities that pervaded medieval society. In this sense, the jester was a double-sided figure, at once a subversive force and a tool of social control. As the Middle Ages gave way to the early modern period, the role of the court jester began to decline. With the rise of new forms of entertainment and the changing tastes of the aristocracy, the jester's trade became increasingly obsolete. By the 18th century, the heyday of the court fool had largely passed, and many jesters found themselves out of work and adrift in a changing world. But even as the jester faded from the scene, his legacy endured. The figure of the wise fool, the truth-teller in motley, would continue to capture the popular imagination, from Shakespeare's Fools to the satirical comics of the modern era. And in the annals of history, the court jesters of old remain a testament to the enduring power of wit, irreverence, and the human spirit in the face of adversity. For in the end, the jester's story is a deeply human one, a tale of individuals struggling to find meaning and purpose in a world that often seemed cruel and capricious. Though they may have been fools by trade, the best of them were anything but foolish. Through their jests and their japes, they held up a mirror to the follies of the mighty, and in so doing, they left an indelible mark on the world they inhabited. So let us raise a glass to the jesters of old, those merry men and women who danced on the edge of danger and laughter. In their wit and their wisdom, their courage and their cunning, they embodied the indomitable spirit of the human soul. And though their laughter may have long since faded, their legacy endures, a testament to the enduring power of humour in the face of adversity. As we drift off to sleep, let us dream of a world where laughter reigns supreme, where the wise fools hold court and the mighty learn to laugh at their own follies. For in the end, perhaps that is the greatest lesson the jesters have to teach us, that in the face of life's cruelties and absurdities, sometimes the only sane response is to simply laugh and carry on. As the sun set on another day of revelry in the great hall, the court jester retired to his modest quarters, exhausted from a long day of delighting nobles with clever quips and daring acrobatics. Removing his colourful motley and cap of bells, he caught his reflection in a polished metal mirror. The face staring back at him seemed almost unrecognisable, without the painted-on smile and playful expression that were his constant mask. Sinking onto his small, hard cot, the jester allowed himself a heavy sigh, releasing the tension he always carried in his shoulders from maintaining a perpetually mirthful demeanour. For all the laughter and gaiety he brought to the court, his own life had held far more tears and hardship. But such was the lot of the lowly entertainer, to be ever the fool, even if one's own heart was breaking. The jester's mind wandered back to his childhood, a time that seemed lifetimes ago. He had been born the son of peasants, with no prospects in life other than toiling in the fields or perhaps learning a humble trade. But fate had dealt him a different hand, in the form of a body that never seemed to grow past that of a small child. His diminutive stature and impish features had marked him as different from a young age. The other children in his village had teased him mercilessly, making him the butt of cruel jokes and pranks. But even then, he had learned to deflect their mockery with self-deprecating humour, to make himself the willing fool so that their laughter couldn't sting as sharply. When a travelling troupe of performers had passed through his village, the young dwarf had begged them to take him on, seeing a chance to escape his hard-scrabble existence. The troupe master had quickly recognised the potential in the quick-witted lad and agreed to make him an apprentice. And so began the jester's education in the arts of tomfoolery, from juggling and tumbling to singing bawdy songs and cracking wise. The skills he acquired served him well when he eventually caught the eye of a nobleman who was amused by his antics and brought him to court as his personal entertainer. The jester had thought himself lucky at the time to have a steady position and access to the luxuries of the royal household. But he soon learned that life in the castle was in many ways no easier than the one he had left behind. For all the fine food and fancy clothes, he was still a servant, wholly dependent on his master's whims and goodwill. He had to be ever alert, reading the moods of the court and tailoring his jokes and jibes accordingly. a quip that had the king guffawing one day might earn him a lashing the next if the ruler was in a foul temper. And always, there was the knowledge that he was ultimately expendable, a mere trinket that could be discarded or even destroyed at a moment's notice. He had seen it happen to other jesters over the years. One had been beaten to death by a noble he had offended, another banished from court for a misfired jest. The jester had learned to tread that fine line carefully, to use his wit as both a weapon and a shield. He wasn't afraid to speak truth to power when the moment called for it, but he always couched his criticisms in the guise of playful foolery, so that they could be laughed off if they hit too close to home. There was the time, for instance, when the king had been mulling a new tax on the peasantry to fund his latest military campaign. The jester had slyly suggested that perhaps His Majesty might consider taxing the nobles' fancy hats and jewels instead, since they could surely afford it more than the poor farmers. The king had roared with laughter at the absurdity of the idea, but the jester had seen the calculating look in his eyes and knew that his words had hit their mark. In moments like those, the jester felt a glimmer of satisfaction, a sense that he wasn't merely a powerless pawn, but could make a real difference in the world, even in some small way. It was a heady feeling, but a dangerous one too. A jester who fancied himself a kingmaker was liable to lose more than his position if he overplayed his hand. For the most part, though, the jester knew his place and played his expected role. He cartwheeled and cavorted, sang and sassed, all to keep his patrons smiling and distracted from their own cares and worries. And if sometimes, in the privacy of his own chambers, the tears came, and he mourned the life he might have had, the love he would likely never know, well, that was a secret he would keep hidden behind his painted smile and twinkling eyes. For a jester's duty was to bring joy to others, even at the cost of his own. But on nights like this, when the weariness seeped into his bones and the faces of the court seemed especially cruel and calculating in his mind's eye, he couldn't help but wonder how much longer he could keep up the charade. How many more years could he play the fool, while his own heart withered behind his motley? He had known other jesters who had simply broken under the strain of it all, their wits crumbling along with their will to go on. Some had taken to drink, drowning their sorrows in wine or ale, until they were as much a fool off the stage as on it. Others had simply vanished one day, slipping out of the castle never to be seen again, perhaps to seek a new life far from the oppressive confines of court. The jester himself had been tempted by that path more than once. In his darkest moments, he had fantasized about stealing away in the night, shedding his jester's garb, and making for some far-off land where no one knew him as anything but an ordinary man. But something had always held him back, whether it was fear of the unknown or some perverse sense of duty to the role he had been given in life. Or perhaps it was simply that he knew no other way to be, that the mask of the jester had become so firmly fixed upon him that he wasn't sure there was a real face underneath anymore. With a sigh, the jester reached for the candle guttering on his small table and pinched out its flame between his fingers. In the sudden darkness, he could almost pretend that he was someone else entirely, that the cap and bells were just a strange dream that would fade with the morning light. But as he closed his eyes and drifted into an uneasy sleep, he knew that come dawn, he would once again don his motley and paint on his smile, ready to play the fool for another day. For that was the jester's lot in life, to bring laughter into the world, even as his own heart wept. As the medieval court slept, nobles and servants alike dreaming of glory, or simply a full belly, the jester too surrendered to slumber. His last thought a wistful wish that perhaps, in some other life, he might have been more than just a sad clown in a colourful costume, forever doomed to jest and jape for the amusement of his betters. But for now, the weary fool could only hope that his dreams, at least, would be filled with more mirth than melancholy. As the sun set over the stone walls of the castle, long shadows stretched across the courtyard. The raucous laughter and chatter from the great hall grew louder, signalling that the evening's feast was well underway. Lords and ladies draped in sumptuous velvets and glittering jewels sat at long wooden tables laden with savoury meats, crusty breads, and goblets overflowing with rich red wine. At the head table, the king surveyed the lively scene, a satisfied smile on his ruddy face. To his right, the queen delicately sipped from a golden chalice, her elegant fingers sparkling with rings. The air hummed with music and conversation, as servants wove between the tables, replenishing plates and keeping goblets filled. Amidst all the finery and revelry, a lone figure stood out, the court jester. Clad in a motley patchwork of bright colours, tassels, and jangling bells, he darted between the tables, his quick wit and lively antics drawing laughter and applause from the tipsy nobles. With a fluid flip, he landed before the king and launched into a ribald tale, his hands gesturing animatedly. None of the merrymakers suspected the sorrows that lurked beneath the jester's painted smile. For behind the cheerful mask, there often lay a tragic figure, one whose life was not his own, forever bound in service and beholden to the whims of the court. Such was the paradoxical existence of the medieval court jester. To unravel the poignant history woven into the jester's motley, we must first peer back through the mists of time to the very origins of the jesting profession. Long before the rise of medieval royalty, ancient civilizations prized wits and fools of their own. In the dusty heat of ancient Egypt, dwarfs and hunchbacks earned favored positions in the pharaoh's court, their unusual appearance seen as a divine gift that brought good fortune and laughter. Clay figures found in ancient tombs depict these early jesters, their faces frozen in joyful grins. The Greeks too had a taste for clowning and satire. Records tell of gelatopoioi, or laughter makers, who entertained at aristocratic drinking parties, telling bawdy jokes and performing physical comedy. One famous jester, a hunchback dwarf named Aesop, allegedly spun fanciful fables that veiled sharp social critiques, a template many later jesters would follow. In the declining days of the Roman Empire, the imperial court rang with the quips of scurae, a name for buffoons derived from the Greek word for banter. These clever men amused even as the kingdom crumbled, delivering witty barbs and risque pantomimes. Some held surprising sway, like the jester Plautus, who won the favour of the Emperor Nero. As Rome gave way to the Middle Ages, the jester evolved into a fixture of European courts from Iberia to Germany. In a strict feudal hierarchy of princes, bishops, knights, and serfs, the jester occupied a unique role as both insider and outsider. Jesters were granted special privileges and access to the most powerful rulers, a seat at the royal table, lodgings in the castle, and a degree of immunity to mock and challenge the highborn set them apart. Yet at the same time, they were rarely of noble blood themselves, more often drawn from the lowest rungs of society. Many were individuals with disabilities or deformities, their unusual appearance part of their appeal. Others had fallen on hard times, finding in jesting a way to survive by their quick wits. Most could never aspire to titles, lands, or a true place in the rigid hierarchy, forever dependent on their master's goodwill. To navigate this precarious existence, medieval jesters had to be masters of many talents. Acrobatics, juggling, music, storytelling, and verbal jousts were all tools of the trade. But above all, it was the jester's razor-sharp wit that was his greatest asset and defense. A clever quip could diffuse a tense moment or shift the king's mood with a well-timed jest. But the same wit that earned laughter one day could provoke offense the next if the jester misjudged his audience. It was a delicate balancing act to amuse without overstepping, to mock without giving true insult. The jester's appearance was as distinctive as his role, instantly marking him as separate from the finery that surrounded him. The classic motley costume was a patchwork of bright colours: reds, greens, yellows and purples, stitched together in diamond patterns. Tassels and floppy hats trimmed with bells that jangled with each step completed the look. Some jesters brandished props to accent their performances. Puppets, amarot or jester's staff with a carved fool's head and inflated pig's bladders for smacking and fart noises were all popular choices. But the most important prop was the jester's own face, often accented with makeup to exaggerate his expressions. This eye-catching appearance was immortalized in the playing card decks that swept medieval Europe. While kings, queens and knaves were rendered in regal garb, the Joker card stood out with his silly cap and bells, the only card that could trump royalty in some games, a fitting tribute to the topsy-turvy role of the jester. This distinctive look was more than mere entertainment. It was part of the jester's carefully cultivated persona as a harmless fool, someone who could speak hard truths behind a veil of silly jests. In effect, the jester became an informal advisor to the king, able to criticize policies and point out hard realities that other courtiers dared not voice. One famous example of this was the French jester Triboulet, who served both Kings Louis XII and Francis I in the early 1500s. According to legend, Triboulet once criticized King Francis for spending too much time hawking instead of attending to matters of state. Annoyed, Francis threatened to execute Triboulet for his impudence. Quick-witted even in the face of death, Triboulet replied, "Ah, but you won't find another fool like me." The king had to admit the truth of the statement and laughingly dismiss the threat. In this way, the jester could wield surprising influence from his seeming position of weakness. But for every tale of a jester skillfully speaking truth to power, there were countless other stories of how easily a jester could fall from favour. The sense of invincibility that some jesters felt was, in truth, as illusory as the court's revelry. Will Sommers, the famed jester of King Henry VIII, discovered this precarity when his wit finally went too far. In the later years of Henry's reign, when the increasingly paranoid king was conducting a ruthless purge of potential enemies, Sommers made the mistake of defending a friend who had been arrested on trumped-up charges. Sommers begged the king to show mercy, citing his friend's innocence, but his words only inflamed Henry's temper. The once favoured jester was banished from court, leaving him to spend his final years in lonely isolation. A poignant example of how quickly a jester's fortunes could turn. Indeed, for all the privileges they enjoyed, medieval jesters led a strange half-life, forever dependent on the fickle moods of their royal patrons. They might dine at the king's table one night and be cast out to the streets the next. Their usefulness expired. Such was the fate of the English court dwarf Geoffrey Hudson, who served Queen Henrietta Maria in the 1600s. Famously presented to the Queen by being hidden inside a large pie, a common jest to delight noble audiences, Hudson rose to become one of her favourite entertainers. In a startling turn of events, Hudson even ended up fighting in the English Civil War, where he was captured and imprisoned by parliamentary forces. But upon his release, the fading royal court had little use for the ageing dwarf. He died in poverty, his service forgotten, a sad end for a man once celebrated across England. Hudson's tale highlights the bleak reality behind the jester's jolly facade. For many, jesting was not a choice, but a necessity, the only path available for those on the margins of society. With little control over their own fates, jesters could only hope to curry enough favour to ensure a comfortable life, a fragile arrangement that could crumble at any moment. This grim truth has given rise to the enduring archetype of the sad clown, a figure whose outward humour conceals inner anguish. While the idea has become cliché, it contains a kernel of very real pain, one that informed the lives of many historical jesters. The Italian jester Pietro Ganella, who served at the court of Duke Borso d'Este in the 1400s, embodied this dichotomy. Celebrated for his wit and beloved by the Duke, Gonella nevertheless led a troubled life, struggling with depression and loneliness. In one poignant anecdote, Gonella was said to have quipped, "I am the Duke's fool, but he is not my Duke." Behind the quip lay a hard reality, that no matter how much the Duke favoured him, Gonella was keenly aware of the unbridgeable gap between them. He might entertain nobles, but he would never truly be one of them, forever an outsider looking in. This alienation could take an even darker turn, as in the disturbing tale of the French Jester Morosini. When Morosini's antics finally exhausted the patience of the royal court, the Jester was brutally beaten and his tongue cut out as punishment. A horrific act that underscores the expendability of even the most celebrated entertainers. Yet despite the hardships they faced, medieval jesters were more than mere victims. They were also surprisingly complex figures who played a vital role in the social and psychological fabric of their time. In a strictly hierarchical world, the Jester represented a crucial safety valve, a means to express subversive ideas and relieve social tensions. On a deeper level, the Jester embodied the archetype of the sacred fool, a seemingly absurd figure who nevertheless speaks profound truths. By inverting the normal order and celebrating foolishness, the Jester created a space for criticizing the status quo and imagining alternatives, if only for a moment. This is the secret power of the Jester, the ability to challenge authority and orthodox thinking under the guise of harmless humor. Like the fool in Shakespeare's plays, the Jester could voice insights that cut to the heart of the human condition, exposing the follies of kings and commoners alike. Even as the age of court jesters waned in the 1600s and 1700s, this enigmatic figure continued to work his strange magic. In the plays of Shakespeare and Molière, in the novels of Victor Hugo and Kurt Vonnegut, the Jester endured as a symbol of mirth and melancholy, wisdom and absurdity. And so, the Jester's legacy lives on to the present day, in the antics of comedians and clowns, in the biting satire of political cartoons, in the very idea that laughter can be a force for change and truth in a troubled world. Though the historical Jester has vanished into the mists of time, his spirit remains as vital as ever. As we look back across the centuries to the forgotten lives of men like Geoffrey Hudson and Pietro Gonella, we catch a glimpse of the strange duality that defines the human experience. In the Jester's plight, we see our own struggle to find meaning and connection in a world that often seems cruel and capricious. And in his laughter, we find a kind of redemption, a defiant insistence on joy and absurdity in the face of life's hardships. Though the Jester's motley may be faded and torn, his bells long since silenced, the echo of his wit continues to resound through the ages, reminding us of the enduring power of humour in even the darkest of times. So let us pause for a moment to remember the court jester, that enigmatic figure who once danced and tumbled in the candle-lit halls of kings. Let us honour his clever words and his sad wisdom, his laughter and his tears. And in the silence of this fading evening, let us strain to hear the faint jingle of his bells, still echoing softly from the distant past. As the sun set over the castle walls, casting long shadows across the courtyard, the weary Jester trudged back to his humble quarters. He removed his colourful motley, the fabric heavy with the weight of the day's performance. The bells on his hat jingled faintly as he placed it on a shelf, a mocking echo of the laughter that had filled the great hall just hours before. The Jester sat down on his narrow bed, his body aching from the physical demands of his trade. Jesters were expected to be skilled acrobats, dancers, and jugglers, in addition to their quick wit and clever wordplay. Many spent years honing their craft, learning to balance on tight ropes, juggle knives, and perform elaborate flips and tumbles. Some, like the famous French jester Triboulet, were even acclaimed for their skill at chess, a game that demanded strategic thinking and mental agility. But for all their talents, jesters remained trapped in a gilded cage. Their livelihood depended entirely on the whims of their royal masters. A jester who failed to amuse or offended the wrong noble could quickly find themselves out of favour and cast aside. The constant pressure to perform and the knowledge that they could be replaced on a whim weighed heavily on many jesters. As the jester lay back on his bed, his mind wandered to the story of Geoffrey Hudson, a dwarf jester in the court of Queen Henrietta Maria of England. Hudson's small stature made him a novelty, and he was often the butt of cruel jokes and pranks. In one infamous incident, the Duke of Buckingham served Hudson to the Queen in a pie, much to the amusement of the court. But for Hudson, it was a humiliating reminder of his lack of agency and control over his own life. The jester sighed, feeling a kinship with Hudson and the countless other jesters who had been treated as little more than property by their royal masters. It was a precarious existence, always one misstep away from ruin. Many jesters came from difficult backgrounds, born into poverty or burdened with physical deformities that made them outcasts in medieval society. For them, the role of jester offered a chance at a better life, but it was a life still marked by hardship and indignity. As the night grew deeper, the jester's thoughts turned to the darker aspects of his profession. Jesters were often seen as expendable, their lives and well-being secondary to the amusement of the court. If a jester became ill or injured and could no longer perform, they could be cast out with little thought or care. Even those who served faithfully for decades could find themselves abandoned in their old age, left to fend for themselves in a world that had little use for a fool who could no longer make others laugh. It was a bitter irony, the jester mused, that those who brought so much joy and laughter to others were often denied those same comforts in their own lives. Behind the painted smiles and quick wit, many jesters grappled with deep wells of sadness and loneliness. They were the original sad clowns, their inner turmoil masked by the merry facade they presented to the world. As the first rays of dawn began to creep through the narrow window of his quarters, the jester knew that he would soon have to don his motley once more and face another day of performing for the court. He would smile and laugh and dance, all while keeping his true feelings locked away deep inside. It was the fate of the jester to bring light to others while living in the shadows themselves. But even in the midst of their hardships, some jesters found ways to use their unique position to their advantage. In the royal courts of Europe, jesters were granted a rare degree of freedom to speak truth to power. Protected by their presumed foolishness, they could criticize and mock the nobility in ways that would be unthinkable for anyone else. One of the most famous examples of this was Will Somers, the jester of King Henry VIII of England. Somers was known for his sharp wit and his willingness to speak his mind, even to the notoriously temperamental king. On one occasion, when Henry was considering executing a group of prisoners, Somers reportedly quipped, "No, no, my liege. Let them live and grow fat, that they may make better sport for us at their expense later." The king, amused by Somers' audacity, spared the prisoners' lives. But such moments of influence were rare, and even the most clever jester could only push their luck so far. The jester's wit may have been a weapon, but it was a double-edged sword, always threatening to cut both ways. A careless word or an ill-timed jest could bring down the full wrath of a displeased monarch with devastating consequences. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the jester began to prepare for another day of performative foolery. He painted his face with exaggerated expressions, transforming himself into the grinning, capering figure that the court expected him to be. But beneath the mask, his mind was heavy with the weight of his own thoughts and memories. He thought of the great jesters of the past, figures like Triboulet and Chicot, who had used their wits to navigate the treacherous waters of the royal court. They had been clever and quick, always ready with a joke or a riddle to diffuse tension or to sway the opinions of their masters. But even they had not been immune to the whims of fate, their stars rising and falling with the shifting tides of royal favour. As he stepped out into the courtyard, the jester squinted against the bright sunlight. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for another day of laughter and sorrow, of merriment and melancholy. It was the lot of the jester to dance on the knife's edge of comedy and tragedy, never quite knowing which way the blade would fall. But perhaps, he mused, there was a deeper meaning to the jester's role, beyond mere entertainment. In a world of rigid hierarchies and unyielding social norms, the jester represented a figure of chaos and inversion, a walking embodiment of the world turned upside down. Through their antics and their wit, they held up a mirror to the follies and vices of their betters, exposing the cracks in the facade of nobility and power. In that sense, the jester was more than just a fool or a clown. They were a vital safety valve for the tensions and contradictions of medieval society, a means of releasing the pressure that might otherwise build to a dangerous boiling point. By mocking the powerful and giving voice to the voiceless, the jester played a crucial role in maintaining the delicate balance of the social order. As the jester made his way towards the great hall, he could hear the murmur of voices and the clink of goblets from within. He paused for a moment, his hand resting on the heavy wooden door. Then, with a deep breath and a final jingle of his bells, he pushed the door open and strode into the room, ready to once again take on the mantle of the laughing fool. But even as he began his performance, leaping and twirling and cracking jokes, the jester's mind was never far from the deeper truths that lay beneath the surface of his foolery. He knew that his was a precarious existence, balanced on the razor's edge of royal favour and public opinion. At any moment, he could fall from grace, tumbling down into the abyss of obscurity and despair. Yet he also knew that there was power in his position, a strange and subversive kind of influence that came from being the court's licensed truth-teller. Through his jests and his riddles, he could speak truth to power in a way that no one else could, shining a light on the hypocrisies and absurdities of the world around him. As the day wore on, and the jester's performance reached its climax, he could feel the energy of the room shifting, the laughter and the applause washing over him like a wave. For a moment, he felt a sense of connection with his audience, a fleeting glimpse of the shared humanity that lay beneath the surface of their differences. But as the last notes of his final song faded away, and the nobles began to drift off to their own pursuits, the jester felt the weight of his own loneliness settling back onto his shoulders. He was a man apart, forever separated from the world of his betters by the motley he wore and the role he played. As he made his way back to his quarters, the jester's mind was heavy with the knowledge of his own precarity. He knew that his time in the sun was fleeting, that the favour of the court could shift like the wind. But he also knew that he had a duty to his craft, to the ancient art of the fool that stretched back centuries. In the end, the jester mused, perhaps that was the true meaning of his life's work, to be a walking reminder of the fleeting nature of power and glory, to hold up a mirror to the follies and foibles of the world. It was a heavy burden to bear, but it was one that he bore with a strange kind of pride. As he lay down on his narrow bed, the jester closed his eyes and let the weariness of the day wash over him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new jests to be made, and new truths to be told. But for now, he could rest, secure in the knowledge that he had played his part in the grand drama of the court. And so, the jester slept. His motley hung carefully on its peg, his bells silent for a few precious hours. In his dreams, he wandered through a world of laughter and tears, of joy and sorrow, a world where the line between foolishness and wisdom was ever blurred. It was the world of the jester, a place of magic and mystery where the ancient art of the fool could still hold sway over the hearts and minds of kings and commoners alike. As the Jester's story fades into the mists of history, we are left to ponder the enduring legacy of these enigmatic figures. In a world that often seems too serious and too cynical for its own good, perhaps we could all benefit from a little more foolishness in our lives. From the court jesters of old to the comedians and satirists of today, those who dare to speak truth to power and to find laughter in the face of adversity remind us of the resilience of the human spirit. So let us raise a toast to the jesters, those brave and foolish souls who dance on the edge of the abyss, bringing light to the darkness and laughter to the sorrow. May their wit and their wisdom never be forgotten, and may their spirits continue to inspire us all to embrace the power of the fool within ourselves. And with that, our journey into the tragic and triumphant life of the medieval court jester draws to a close. As we drift off to sleep, let us carry with us the memory of their laughter and their tears, their bravery and their sacrifice. In a world that often seems too full of shadows, the jester's tale reminds us that there is always light to be found, if only we have the courage to seek it out. So rest well, dear listeners, and may your dreams be filled with the sound of jingling bells and the echoes of ancient laughter. For in the end, perhaps the greatest lesson the jester has to teach us is simply this, that even in the darkest of times, there is always room for a little bit of foolishness, a little bit of joy, and a little bit of hope. The court jester was a master of timing, knowing just when to interject with a clever quip or a well-placed pun. In a society rigidly structured by hierarchy and protocol, the jester's wit provided a welcome release, a chance to laugh at the absurdities of life and power. Yet the jester's humour was not simply frivolous entertainment. It often concealed a deeper wisdom, a keen observation of human nature and the follies of the great. One such jester renowned for his wit was Triboulet, who served in the court of King Francis I of France in the early 16th century. Triboulet was no ordinary fool. He was sharp-tongued and quick-witted, unafraid to speak truth to power. Though physically deformed with a large head and small body, Triboulet's intellect was formidable. He used his jests as a weapon to expose hypocrisy and challenge authority. There are many legends about Triboulet's audacious quips. In one famous story, King Francis, enraged by the jester's insolence, threatened to have him executed. Triboulet, thinking quickly, responded, "Ah, but you would regret it. You'd never find another fool as good as me." The king, amused by the jester's clever retort, laughed and spared his life. Whether or not this particular tale is true, it illustrates the precarious position of the court jester. Their humour granted them a special license to criticise, but they had to tread a delicate line. One wrong jest could mean the difference between laughter and the executioner's blade. Another story underscores Triboulet's shrewd judgment. King Francis once asked the jester what punishment should be given to a nobleman who had gravely offended the king. Triboulet replied, "Sire, you should hang him." The king, taken aback, said that the nobleman was of high birth and should be shown mercy. "Well then," Triboulet responded, "let him choose the tree on which he would prefer to be hanged." By suggesting an impossible choice, Triboulet deftly pointed out the absurdity of the king's logic. Through his jests, Triboulet not only amused, but held a mirror up to power, revealing its contradictions and conceit. In doing so, he demonstrated the deeper function of the court fool as a vital safety valve in the tense world of palace politics. The jester's witticisms allowed kings and nobles to laugh at themselves, providing a space for humility and self-reflection that was rare in the lofty halls of the court. Yet for all their influence, jesters like Triboulet ultimately wielded little real power. They were, in the end, mere servants, their fate tied to the whims and moods of their royal masters. The very qualities that made a jester successful, wit, boldness, perceptiveness, could also be their undoing if they overstepped or offended. This is poignantly illustrated in the story of Archibald Armstrong, court jester to King James I and Charles I of England in the early 17th century. Known as Archie, Armstrong was celebrated for his acerbic verses that spared no one, not even the highest members of court and clergy. For a time, Armstrong's sharp tongue made him a favourite of King James, who gave him unusual leeway to mock and criticise. However, Armstrong's wit eventually proved too biting. His verses satirising church officials led to complaints, and he was finally banished from court in 1637 after insulting the Queen and attacking the King's controversial fiscal policies. After a lifetime of royal favour, Armstrong spent his final years in disgrace and poverty, dying in London around 1672. His fate was a sobering reminder of the jester's dependence on his master's goodwill. The decline of Armstrong coincided with a broader shift in attitudes towards jesters in the 17th century. As Renaissance ideas spread and notions of decorum and civility changed, the ribald antics and caustic satire of jesters began to be seen as crude and outmoded. Increasingly, jesters were viewed as relics of a more barbarous age, their physical deformities and mental deficiencies objects of pity or scorn rather than amusement. At the same time, the rise of print culture and professional theatre offered new forms of entertainment that competed with the traditional fool. In the plays of Shakespeare and others, the wise fool became a standard character, but one who existed safely within the confines of fiction, not the dangerous reality of the court. By the end of the 17th century, the age of the court jester was largely over, though they would linger on in some pockets of Europe until the 18th century. Yet, even as the historical figure of the court jester faded, their legacy endured. The jester's distinctive costume, with its floppy belled cap and motley colours, became an iconic symbol, shorthand for the notion of the wise fool who speaks truth to power. In literature, film, and popular culture, the jester emerged as an archetypal figure, one whose humour and wisdom continue to resonate across the centuries. Moreover, the deeper significance of the court jester as a social and psychological role has intrigued modern scholars. In the 20th century, cultural anthropologists and literary critics have analysed the jester as a key figure of liminality and transgression. By crossing boundaries and upsetting norms, the jester, like the trickster of myth, serves a vital function in society, providing an outlet for repressed desires and a challenge to the status quo. In this sense, perhaps, we can understand the court jester as a sacrifice. Their odd appearance and behaviour place them on the margins of society, neither fully part of the court nor completely separate from it. This liminal status granted them the ability to speak and act in ways others could not, but it also made them perpetual outsiders, never fully accepted or secure. They were, in a sense, scapegoats who bore the burden of speaking uncomfortable truths and embodying the chaotic and unruly aspects of human nature. This is the poignant paradox of the jester's life. Their wit and humour brought joy and insight, but it came at a personal cost. They were prisoners of their role, bound to a lonely existence on the fringes of society. The laughter they inspired was tinged with melancholy, for it arose from a deep well of pain and alienation. Perhaps this is why the figure of the sad clown has endured as a powerful cultural motif. In the haunting image of the performer who smiles through tears, we see reflected the jester's dilemma, the anguish behind the laughter. It is a reminder that humour is often born of suffering, that those who bring us joy may carry hidden sorrows. As we look back on the long and complex history of the court jester, it is this poignant humanity that strikes us most forcefully, For all their strangeness and otherness, jesters were not mere caricatures or symbols, but real individuals who struggled, like all of us, to find meaning and dignity in a world that often denied them both. In their triumphs and tragedies, their laughter and tears, we see a reflection of the human condition in all its absurdity and pathos. In the end, the story of the court jester is a testament to the enduring power of humour and the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the cruelty and indignities they faced, jesters managed to create art and meaning in the midst of adversity. They used their wit and imagination to carve out a space for themselves in a society that had no place for them. And in doing so, they left a legacy that continues to inspire and challenge us to this day. So the next time you hear a joke or laugh at a clever quip, spare a thought for the court jesters of old, those brilliant and tragic figures who dared to speak truth to power and find humour in the darkest of times. In their stories, we may just find a glimmer of our own humanity, a reminder of the laughter and tears that bind us all. And in that shared laughter, perhaps, we can find a moment of grace, a fleeting glimpse of the wise fool's eternal wisdom. As we drift off to sleep, let us carry with us the jester's spirit of irreverence and resilience. Let us remember that even in the darkest of times, humour and humanity can still shine through. And let us dream of a world where wit and wisdom are valued above power and privilege, where the outsider's voice is heard and celebrated. In that spirit, let us bid goodnight to the ghosts of jesters past, secure in the knowledge that their laughter echoes still through the ages, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and may you find joy and wisdom in the coming day. As the sun set over the medieval kingdom, the great hall of the royal palace came alive with the flicker of torchlight and the murmur of courtly conversation. Lords and ladies bedecked in their finest garments milled about, eagerly awaiting the evening's entertainment. At the far end of the hall, seated upon a gilded throne, the king surveyed his court with a mix of pride and ennui. He had seen countless such gatherings, and the idle chatter of his courtiers had long since lost its charm. But then, with a sudden burst of music and a clatter of bells, a most peculiar figure came bounding into the hall, the court jester, clad in a motley assortment of brightly coloured rags, with a floppy hat festooned with bells and donkey ears perched atop his head. The jester cut a striking figure amidst the staid finery of the court. With a mischievous grin and a twinkle in his eye, he began to caper and dance, singing bawdy songs and telling outrageous tales that soon had the whole court roaring with laughter. To the casual observer, the jester seemed the very picture of merriment and good cheer, a delightful diversion from the cares and intrigues of court life. But those who looked closer might have caught a glimpse of something else lurking beneath the jester's jovial exterior. A flicker of melancholy, a hint of pain. For the life of a court jester, though filled with laughter and applause, was not an easy one. Behind the painted smile and quick wit lay a much darker tale, one of hardship, heartbreak, and the heavy burden of living always on the knife's edge between royal favour and ruin. The tradition of the court fool was an ancient one, with roots stretching back to the very dawn of civilization. In the great courts of ancient Egypt, pharaohs were attended by dwarves and hunchbacks, whose antics and jests were said to amuse the gods themselves. The Greeks and Romans, too, delighted in the absurd antics of their mimes and buffoons, who parodied the foibles of the mighty with impunity. But it was in the courts of medieval Europe that the jester truly came into his own. In a world rigidly structured by rank and birth, where a misplaced word or a breach of etiquette could mean disgrace or even death, the jester occupied a unique position. He was the one person in the court who was allowed, even expected, to speak truth to power, to mock the pretensions of the great lords and ladies, to puncture their pomposity with a well-timed jest or a cutting remark. It was a role that required a rare combination of talents. A successful jester had to be quick-witted and silver-tongued, able to improvise a clever rhyme or a biting quip at a moment's notice. He had to be a skilled performer, adept at music, dance, and acrobatics. And perhaps most importantly, he had to possess an uncanny ability to read the moods of his royal audience, to know just how far he could push the boundaries of propriety before he crossed the line into offense. For those who mastered these skills, the rewards could be great. A beloved jester could become a trusted confidant of the king, privy to the innermost secrets of the court. He could use his influence to sway royal policy, to plead the case of the downtrodden and oppressed. In a world where power was jealously guarded and ruthlessly wielded, the jester's wit was his weapon, a way to level the playing field, if only for a moment. But for all the privileges and protections afforded by the jester's motley coat, his was a precarious existence. He was, after all, still a servant, a piece of royal property to be bought, sold, or discarded at the whim of his master. And in a world where the favour of the mighty was as fickle as the wind, even the most skilled and beloved jester could find himself out of favour and out of a job in an instant. Consider the tale of Geoffrey Hudson, the diminutive jester who served at the court of King Charles I of England. Born to a poor family in Rutlandshire, the young Geoffrey's small stature, he stood just 18 inches tall at the age of 7, soon brought him to the attention of the Duchess of Buckingham, who took him into her household as a human pet. In 1626, the Duchess presented Geoffrey to the King and Queen at a grand banquet, where he was famously served to the royals in a large pie. The Queen was so delighted by the tiny jester that she took him into her own service, and for a time Geoffrey enjoyed all the privileges and favours of a royal favourite. But Geoffrey's charmed life was not to last. As political tensions mounted between the King and Parliament, the Queen's influence waned, and with it, Geoffrey's own fortunes. In 1641, at the outbreak of the English Civil War, Geoffrey was captured by parliamentary forces and imprisoned for his loyalty to the crown. Though he was eventually freed, Geoffrey's time in captivity had taken a toll on his health and spirit. He withdrew from public life and died in obscurity in 1682, his once bright star long since faded. Geoffrey's story was a tragic one, but it was far from unique among the annals of court jesters. For every jester who enjoyed a long and celebrated career, there were countless others who met with misfortune, disgrace, or worse. The life of a fool, for all its glitter and glamour, was a hard one, a constant high-wire act performed without a net, where one false step could spell disaster. Even those jesters who managed to avoid the worst fates often grappled with their own inner demons, the very qualities that made them so successful in their craft: the quick wit, the irreverent humour, the ability to see through the pretenses of the powerful, could also be a source of great pain and alienation. Many jesters came from difficult backgrounds. They were often individuals who had been marginalised by society due to their physical appearance, their social status, or their unconventional ways of thinking. For these outcasts, the role of the jester offered a rare chance at social acceptance and even a measure of fame and fortune. But it came at a cost, the cost of always being an outsider, of never quite belonging to the world they so artfully skewered. This sense of isolation could take a heavy toll over time. Beneath the jester's laughing exterior often lurked a profound sadness, the sadness of the perpetual observer, the one who sees too clearly the follies and cruelties of the world, but who must always mask his own pain behind a smile and a jest. In this sense, the jester can be seen as a kind of archetypal figure, a representation of the human condition in all its complexity and contradiction. He is the wise fool, the truth-teller, the one who dares to speak the unspeakable and to hold a mirror up to the powerful and the proud. But he is also the outcast, the misfit, the one who bears the weight of society's scorn and laughter, even as he turns it back upon itself. It is this duality that makes the figure of the jester such an enduring one in our cultural imagination. From the plays of Shakespeare to the films of Fellini, the image of the sad clown, the haunted harlequin, has captured the imagination of artists and audiences alike. And in a world that often seems too full of cruelty and absurdity to bear, the jester's humour, biting, irreverent, yet always shot through with a strain of hard-won wisdom, can feel like a balm, a way of making sense of the senseless. But if the jester's wit could be a source of comfort and catharsis, it could also be a potent weapon in the games of power and influence that swirled around the royal court. A clever fool, one who knew how to walk the fine line between amusing and offending his betters, could wield a surprising amount of influence over the affairs of state. Consider the story of Will Sommers, the beloved jester of King Henry VIII. Born to a poor family in Shropshire, Will rose to become one of the most influential figures at the Tudor court, thanks in large part to his quick wit and his uncanny ability to speak truth to power. Unlike many of his fellow jesters who relied on slapstick antics and bawdy humour to entertain their audiences, Will was known for his sharp political satire and his willingness to challenge the king's decisions to his face. On one famous occasion, when Henry was considering a politically unpopular move, Will presented him with a pair of spectacles, saying, "If your Majesty wears these, you will see things as they really are, not as you wish them to be." It was a daring move, one that could easily have cost Will his head. But Henry, who was known for his mercurial temper and his intolerance of dissent, simply laughed and took the jest in stride. In fact, he came to rely on Will's honest counsel and would often turn to him for advice on matters of state. Will's influence extended beyond the throne room as well. He was known to use his position to advocate for the poor and the powerless, to call out the corruption and hypocrisy of the court, and to prod the king's conscience when it was in danger of being led astray. In a world where speaking truth to power was a dangerous game, Will's foolishness was his shield, a way of saying the unsayable, of holding the mighty to account. But even Will's charms could not protect him forever. As Henry grew older and more paranoid, he became less tolerant of dissent, even from his beloved jester. In 1545, Will was banished from court for reasons that remain unclear. Some say he spoke out too forcefully against the king's policies, others that he simply fell victim to the machinations of his rivals. Whatever the reason, Will's fall from grace was a reminder of the precariousness of the jester's position. No matter how beloved or influential he might be, the fool was always at the mercy of his master's whims. And in a world where power was absolute and unaccountable, even the most clever and courageous jester could find himself out in the cold. This sense of vulnerability, of living always at the edge of disaster, was perhaps the defining feature of the jester's life. No matter how successful he might be, no matter how much influence he might wield, the fool was always aware of the fragility of his position. He knew that his fate hung by a thread, that a single misstep or a change in the political winds could spell his downfall. And yet, for all the dangers and indignities of the jester's life, there was something strangely compelling about the role he played in the life of the court. In a world defined by rigid hierarchies and unyielding codes of behavior, the jester represented a kind of wild card, a figure who could upset the established order, who could speak the unspeakable and imagine the unimaginable. In this sense, the jester can be seen as a kind of trickster figure, a mischievous sprite who delights in overturning the normal rules of society. He is the lord of misrule, the master of the carnivalesque, the one who, for a brief, shining moment, can make the world stand on its head and reveal the absurdity and arbitrariness of the social order. This idea of the jester as a subversive force, a challenger of the status quo, has captured the imagination of generations of artists and writers. From the tragicomic fools of Shakespeare to the anarchic pranksters of the counterculture, the jester has come to symbolize a kind of rebellious spirit, a refusal to accept the world as it is, a determination to imagine something better. But even as we celebrate the jester's rebellious streak, it is important to remember the darker side of his story. For all his wit and courage, the jester was still a product of his time, a figure bound by the cruel realities of life in a feudal society. He may have challenged the powerful, but he was still beholden to them, a servant, a piece of property, a plaything to be discarded when the game grew tiresome. And as the world began to change, as new ideas about power and politics took hold, the jester's role began to evolve as well. In the 17th and 18th centuries, as absolute monarchy gave way to more democratic forms of government, the court jester began to fade from view, a relic of an earlier, more brutal age. Some jesters, like Geoffrey Hudson, simply outlived their usefulness, fading into obscurity as the world moved on around them. Others, like the legendary French jester Triboulet, met with more tragic ends, victims of the very power structures they had so artfully mocked. But even as the jester himself disappeared from the scene, his spirit lived on, in the biting satire of the Enlightenment wits, in the subversive humor of the Dadaists and the Surrealists, in the anarchic energy of the punk rock revolution. Wherever there is power to be challenged, wherever there is a status quo to be overturned, the jester's spirit is there, a reminder of the enduring power of laughter in the face of tyranny and oppression. And so, as we look back on the long and complex history of the court jester, it is worth considering what his story can teach us about our own time. In a world that often seems too full of cruelty and absurdity to bear, the jester's wit and courage can serve as a beacon, a reminder of the importance of speaking truth to power, of holding the mighty to account, of imagining a world beyond the one we know. But the jester's story is also a cautionary tale, a reminder of the limits of individual rebellion, of the dangers of living too close to the flame of power. The jester may have been a truth-teller, a champion of the downtrodden, but he was also a victim, a pawn in the games of the powerful, a sacrificial lamb on the altar of history. And so, as we remember the jester's story, let us do so with both reverence and clear-eyed realism. Let us celebrate his wit and his courage, his ability to speak the unspeakable and to imagine the unimaginable. But let us also remember the price he paid for his truth-telling, the scars he bore, the sacrifices he made, the tragic fate that so often awaited him. In the end, the jester's story is a reminder of the enduring power of the human spirit, of our ability to find laughter in the face of sorrow, to speak truth in the face of power, to imagine a better world even in the darkest of times. It is a story that echoes down through the ages, a testament to the resilience and the creativity of the human soul. And so, as we drift off to sleep, let us spare a thought for the jester, the sad clown, the wise fool, the trickster who dared to dream of a world turned upside down. Let us remember his laughter and his tears, his triumphs and his tragedies, and let us carry his spirit with us as we face the challenges and the absurdities of our own time. For in the end, we are all jesters in the great court of life, playing our parts, donning our masks, walking the high wire between laughter and sorrow, between truth and power. And in the face of all the cruelty and all the madness of the world, perhaps the best we can do is to keep on laughing, to keep on speaking our truth, to keep on imagining something better, no matter the cost. So let us raise a glass to the jester, the fool who dared to dream, the truth-teller who paid the price, the laughter that echoes through the ages. And let us carry his spirit with us always, as we navigate the twists and turns of this strange and wondrous life. A life that, like the Jester's own, is full of both tragedy and triumph, both tears and laughter, both darkness and light. As the sun set over the towering spires of the royal castle, the great hall was awash in the warm glow of flickering torches. The stone walls reverberated with the merry sounds of music, laughter, and chatter as nobles decked in sumptuous velvets and glittering jewels mingled and feasted at the long tables. Servants wove through the crowd bearing trays of roasted meats, savoury pies, and goblets brimming with rich red wine. At the head of the hall, the king and queen presided over the revelry from their elevated thrones, surveying their loyal subjects with regal nods and indulgent smiles. Amidst all the finery and pageantry, one figure stood out from the rest. Darting between the tables with an exaggerated, lurching gait was the court jester, his motley costume a riot of clashing colours and patterns. Bells jangled merrily from the tips of his floppy hood, punctuating his every step and gesture. His face was painted in an exaggerated grin, with comically arched brows and rosy circles on his cheeks. As he pranced and cavorted, lobbing witty jests and playful insults at the chuckling nobles, the jester seemed the very embodiment of levity and good cheer. But for those who looked closer, there was a flicker of something else behind the jester's manic energy and forced smiles, a hint of melancholy in his eyes, a weariness in his step, a note of desperation in his laughter. For beneath the jolly facade, the jester's life was not all mirth and merriment. His was a precarious existence, ever at the whim of his royal master's moods and fancies. In the cutthroat world of the court, where fortunes rose and fell like the tides, the jester was but a lowly servant, a novelty to be discarded when no longer amusing. As the night wore on and the wine flowed ever more freely, the jester's antics grew increasingly frenetic. He juggled daggers, walked on his hands, recited bawdy poems that skirted the edge of blasphemy. Anything to keep his audience entertained, to prove his worth, to stave off the day when he would be cast aside. For the jester knew all too well the fickle nature of fame and favour. Many of history's most renowned jesters came from backgrounds of hardship and adversity. Some were born with physical deformities or dwarfism, their unusual appearance marking them as objects of curiosity and ridicule from a young age. In a society where such differences were often viewed as signs of divine disfavour or moral failing, these individuals had little choice but to embrace the role of the fool. By donning the motley and the manic grin, they could transform their misfortune into a sort of armour, using laughter to deflect pity and scorn. One such jester was Geoffrey Hudson, a dwarf born into an impoverished family in 17th century England. Sold into servitude by his destitute parents, Geoffrey was presented as a gift to the Duke and Duchess of Buckingham when he was just 7 years old. At a lavish banquet, the tiny child was smuggled into the hall concealed beneath the crust of an enormous pie. When the crust was cut open and Geoffrey sprang out in miniature livery, the Duchess was so delighted by the surprise that she hired him on the spot to be her personal fool. For Geoffrey and many other jesters, the luxuries of court life came at a steep price. To be a jester was to be a perpetual outsider, forever marked as different and inferior. In the rigid hierarchy of the court, where nobles guarded their status and dignity with fierce resolve, the jester was a walking paradox. A lowly servant, permitted to speak with shocking freedom, a source of amusement that nobles could laugh with but never truly accept as an equal. The jester's motley was both a ticket to privilege and a badge of shame, a reminder that he was there to serve and entertain, never to belong. Beyond the walls of the court, the origins of the jester stretch back to ancient times. In the royal courts of ancient Egypt, pharaohs were often attended by dwarves who served as personal confidants and companions. These favoured fools were given special privileges and accommodations, and were sometimes even entombed with their masters to serve them in the afterlife. In ancient Greece, the philosopher Diogenes embraced the role of the wise fool, using wit and wordplay to challenge social norms and deflate the egos of the powerful. With his ragged clothes, ascetic lifestyle, and barbed tongue, Diogenes played the part of the court jester to the whole of Athens. According to legend, when Alexander the Great came to visit the philosopher and asked if there was any favour he could do for him, Diogenes replied only that the conqueror could step aside, as he was blocking the sunlight. The story illustrates the peculiar power of the jester to speak truth to power, using his seeming foolishness as a shield against retribution. In the courts of the Roman emperors, the tradition of the entertaining dwarf persisted. The Emperor Augustus was fond of a dwarf jester named Lixius, who was known for his clever quips and comedic timing. Later Roman emperors like Tiberius and Domitian retained whole troops of jesters and fools to keep them diverted with bouts of gladiatorial combat, reenacted by troops of dwarves and other little people. These spectacles, while enormously popular with the masses, reveal the troubling degree to which jesters were objectified and exploited for the amusement of their social betters. As the Roman Empire declined and eventually fell, the tradition of the court fool migrated north to the kingdoms of medieval Europe. In the early Middle Ages, many kings and nobles employed jongleurs, itinerant performers who combined music, acrobatics, and storytelling. While not technically jesters, these travelling entertainers laid the foundations for the role by establishing the court as a place of amusement and diversion. By the 12th century, a new type of performer began to appear in European courts: the professional fool. These fools were different from the simpletons and madmen who had long been regarded as sources of amusement. They were clever, quick-witted, and highly skilled in the arts of mimicry, wordplay, and physical comedy. Some were dwarfs or cripples, their physical deformities serving as a kind of visual shorthand for their foolishness. Others were mentally disabled or mentally ill, their erratic behaviour and disjointed speech seen as a form of divine madness. But many court jesters were perfectly healthy and intelligent individuals who had simply found that playing the fool was a valuable talent in a world where wit and humour were highly prized. These professional fools wore distinctive costumes that set them apart from the rest of the court. The most common was the motley, a garment made of brightly coloured patches sewn together in a haphazard pattern. The fool's motley was often adorned with bells and topped with a hood featuring donkey ears or a coxcomb. This ridiculous attire served to emphasize the fool's otherness and signal to all who saw him that his antics were not to be taken seriously. But the life of a court jester was far from easy. In a world where a misplaced word or an ill-timed jest could mean the difference between favour and disgrace, jesters had to be constantly on their guard. They were expected to walk a razor-thin line between amusement and offence, flattering their masters while also poking fun at their foibles. A skilled jester could use his wit to speak truth to power, subtly critiquing the policies and personalities of the nobles he served. But he had to do so with the utmost tact and cleverness, couching his criticisms in jokes and riddles that could be laughed off if they struck too close to home. One of history's most famous jesters was Will Sommers, the beloved fool of King Henry VIII. Born to a humble family in the early 16th century, Will rose to become one of the most influential figures at the Tudor court. With his sharp tongue and quick wit, he was one of the few people who could speak freely to the notoriously temperamental king. According to one popular story, Henry once threatened to execute Will for a perceived insult. In response, the jester fell to his knees and begged the king to honour his promise to make Will a lord before he died. When Henry asked why he should do such a thing, Will replied that he wanted to die a nobleman. so that he could have the pleasure of seeing a lord hanged for once. The king was so amused by the jester's clever retort that he spared his life. But even Will Sommers was not immune to the vagaries of court politics. When Henry's queen, Anne Boleyn, fell from favour and was accused of adultery and treason, Will was one of the few courtiers who dared to speak out in her defence. He told the king that he would be making a mistake if he executed Anne and urged him to reconsider. But Henry was determined to rid himself of his troublesome wife, and Will's pleas fell on deaf ears. Anne was beheaded in 1536, and Will himself died just a few years later, perhaps of a broken heart. The story of Will Sommers illustrates the precarious position of the court jester. No matter how beloved or favoured he might be, the jester was ultimately a servant, subject to the whims and caprices of his royal master. If he offended the wrong person or said the wrong thing at the wrong time, he could find himself cast out of court or even executed. And even if he managed to avoid such a fate, the constant pressure to perform and amuse could take a heavy toll on his mental and physical health. Many jesters turned to alcohol or other vices to cope with the stress of their position. Others suffered from depression or anxiety, their forced jollity masking a deep inner turmoil. Some jesters even went mad, their minds unhinged by the constant need to play the fool. One such jester was Patch, the fool of Cardinal Wolsey, who was said to have lost his wits after being repeatedly beaten by his master for his jests. Despite the hardships and dangers they faced, court jesters played a vital role in the social and political life of medieval and Renaissance Europe. In a world where power was concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy nobles, jesters served as a kind of safety valve, allowing for the expression of subversive ideas and the release of social tensions. By poking fun at the powerful and exposing their foibles, jesters helped to humanize their masters and remind them of their own mortality. At the same time, jesters were also important cultural figures, serving as conduits for the spread of new ideas and artistic forms. Many jesters were skilled musicians, poets, and storytellers, and their performances helped to shape the literary and artistic traditions of their time. Some jesters even used their position to influence political events, acting as secret agents or go-betweens in the complex web of court intrigue. One of the most famous examples of a jester who wielded political influence was Triboulet, the fool of King Francis I of France. Born with dwarfism and a misshapen head, Triboulet was initially mocked and abused by the courtiers who saw him as little more than a freak. But he soon proved himself to be a master of wit and repartee, using his clever wordplay to deflate the egos of those who sought to humiliate him. According to one famous story, Francis once asked Triboulet what punishment he would deserve if he were to strike the royal jester. Triboulet replied that anyone who struck the king's fool should be executed, but that if the king himself were to do it, he should be forgiven on account of his madness. The story illustrates the way in which jesters could use their perceived foolishness as a shield, allowing them to speak truth to power without fear of retribution. But Triboulet's influence extended beyond mere jests and wordplay. He was also a skilled diplomat and political operative, using his position as the king's confidant to shape French policy and advance his own interests. When Francis was considering an alliance with King Henry VIII of England, Triboulet warned him against it, arguing that the English king was untrustworthy and would betray him at the first opportunity. Francis heeded his jester's advice and instead formed an alliance with the Ottoman Empire, a decision that would have far-reaching consequences for European politics. The tale of Triboulet highlights the paradoxical nature of the court jester. On the one hand, he was a lowly servant, subject to the whims and abuses of his social betters. On the other hand, he was a figure of great influence and power, able to shape the course of history through his wit, cunning, and political acumen. In a world where appearances were everything, the jester's foolishness was was both his greatest weakness and his greatest strength. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, the role of the court jester began to evolve. In the increasingly sophisticated and educated courts of Europe, jesters were no longer seen as mere entertainers, but as intellectual and cultural figures in their own right. Many jesters were highly educated, fluent in multiple languages, and well-versed in the arts and sciences of their time. They used their knowledge and wit to engage in lively debates with scholars and philosophers, and to create elaborate works of art and literature. One of the most famous examples of this new breed of jester was John Heywood, the fool of King Henry VIII's daughter, Queen Mary the Third. Heywood was a skilled poet and playwright, known for his biting satires and clever wordplay. He used his position as the Queen's jester to comment on the religious and political controversies of his time, often pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable speech. In one famous incident, Heywood was performing before the Queen when he made a joke about the Catholic Mass. The Queen, a devout Catholic, was so offended that she ordered Heywood to be arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. But Heywood was able to talk his way out of trouble, using his wit and charm to convince the Queen that he meant no offence. Heywood's story illustrates the delicate balancing act that court jesters had to perform in the increasingly complex and dangerous world of Renaissance politics. As the power of the monarchy began to wane and new ideas about individual rights and freedoms began to take hold, jesters found themselves caught between the old world of absolute authority and the new world of intellectual and political ferment. Some jesters, like Heywood, were able to navigate this changing landscape with skill and aplomb. Others, like the Italian jester Gonella, found themselves caught up in the tumult of the times. Gonella, who served at the court of the Duke of Ferrara in the 16th century, was known for his acerbic wit and biting satire. He used his position to mock the pretensions of the nobility and clergy and to expose the corruption and hypocrisy of the ruling class. But Gonella's jests eventually caught up with him. In 1570, he was arrested and imprisoned on charges of heresy and blasphemy. Despite the efforts of his powerful patrons to secure his release, Gonella was eventually executed, his death a stark reminder of the limits of the jester's freedom and the dangers of speaking truth to power. As the Renaissance gave way to the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason, the role of the court jester began to decline. In a world that increasingly valued rationality, science, and progress, the jester's antics and wordplay came to be seen as frivolous and childish. Many monarchs and nobles began to view jesters as a relic of a bygone age, an embarrassing reminder of the superstitions and follies of the past. By the 18th century, the institution of the court jester had all but disappeared from the courts of Europe. A few monarchs, like Frederick the Great of Prussia, still employed fools and dwarfs for their amusement, but these were increasingly seen as cruel anachronisms, their presence a sign of the decadence and moral decay of the ruling class. Yet even as the court jester faded from the scene, his legacy lived on. In literature, art, and popular culture, the figure of the wise fool remained a potent archetype, a symbol of the subversive power of laughter and the enduring human need for truth and justice. From Shakespeare's Fools to Charlie Chaplin's Tramp, from the Italian Commedia dell'arte to the American circus clown, the jester's spirit continued to inspire and provoke, reminding us of the importance of speaking truth to power and the value of a good laugh in the face of adversity. Today, in a world that often seems more divided and dangerous than ever, the court jester's legacy remains as relevant as ever. In an age of fake news and political polarization, we could all benefit from a dose of the jester's wit and wisdom, his ability to cut through the noise and nonsense and speak truth to power. We could all use a reminder that even in the darkest of times, laughter and humor can be a powerful force for change and healing. So let us remember the court jesters of old, those brave and foolish souls who dared to speak truth to power and to find laughter in the face of adversity. Let us honor their memory by embracing their spirit of subversion and satire, by using our own wit and creativity to challenge the status quo and fight for a more just and humane world. And let us never forget the enduring power of a good joke to bring light into the darkness and to remind us of our shared humanity. As the night wore on and the revellers began to drift off to their beds, the jester remained in the great hall, his energy finally flagging. He slumped against a wall, his face paint-smeared and his bells tinkling soft. As the 17th century dawned, the age of the court jester was already beginning to wane. The Renaissance had brought new ideas and sensibilities to European courts, and the notion of keeping a designated fool for entertainment seemed increasingly outdated. In the more refined salons of the Baroque era, witty conversation and elegant manners were prized over the coarse jests and physical comedy of the jesters. One by one, the positions of court fool began to disappear from royal households across the continent. In England, the last recorded court jester was Muckle John, who served in the court of Charles I until 1649. After the English Civil War and the execution of Charles I, the monarchy was abolished and the royal court disbanded. When the monarchy was eventually restored under Charles II in 1660, the position of court jester was not revived. The reign of Charles II ushered in a new era of courtly entertainment, with a greater emphasis on theatre, music, and dance. In France, the royal court continued to maintain an official jester for a while longer, with the last recorded appointment being that of Jean Langely, who served Louis XIV until his death in 1688. However, even in France, the writing was on the wall for the institution of the court jester. The Sun King's Grand Court at Versailles was a far cry from the raucous medieval halls where jesters had once held sway. In the strict etiquette and refined atmosphere of Versailles, there was little room for the anarchic antics of a fool. As the court jester faded from the scene, some found employment in the theatre, where their comedic talents could still be put to use. In England, actors like Richard Tarleton and William Kemp became famous for their clowning roles on the Elizabethan and Jacobean stage. These court jesters without courts kept alive some of the traditions and techniques of the fool, even as the real-life profession was disappearing. Others were not so fortunate. Many court jesters, especially those with physical deformities or disabilities, found themselves cast out of royal favour as attitudes changed. Some ended up in poverty, struggling to eke out a living by their wits on the streets. The lucky ones might find a noble patron willing to support them in their old age, but for many, the loss of their jester's position meant the loss of their livelihood and their home. The poignant tale of Geoffrey Hudson, the dwarf jester at the court of Queen Henrietta Maria, illustrates the precarious position of these fools. Hudson had been a celebrated figure in his youth, known for his wit and his daring exploits, such as fighting a duel on horseback. However, as he aged and the Queen's favour turned elsewhere, Hudson found himself cast aside. In 1644, he was captured at sea by Barbary pirates and spent 25 years as a slave in North Africa before finally being ransomed and returning to England. He ended his days in penury, dying in 1682 at the age of 63. As the court jesters vanished from the halls of power, they left behind a complex legacy. On one hand, they represented a cruel and callous attitude towards disability and difference, with many jesters treated as little more than human pets by their royal masters. The oft-told story of the jester's funeral, where the fool was supposedly buried alive as a macabre joke, speaks to the expendability of these figures in the eyes of the court. Yet at the same time, the jesters played a vital role in speaking truth to power and puncturing the pretensions of the mighty. In a rigidly hierarchical society, the The Jester was one of the few who could speak freely to the monarch, using wit and wordplay to deliver critiques and commentary that would be unthinkable from any other source. The legendary French jester Triboulet supposedly told King Francis I that he would have the king whipped if Francis ever dared to strike him, a bold statement of the fool's license to challenge authority. Moreover, the jester served an important psychological and symbolic function in medieval and Renaissance society. In a world of strict social roles and codes of conduct, the jester represented a safety valve, a figure who could invert normal order and overturn hierarchy, if only for a brief festive moment. The fool's colourful costume, with its ass's ears and bells, marked him as an outsider, one who was not bound by the usual rules. Through his antics and mockery, the jester could give voice to the repressed desires and frustrations of those who were forced to obey and conform. This idea of the wise fool who uses his seeming madness to speak hidden truths has endured long after the historical court jesters disappeared. From Shakespeare's fools like Touchstone and Fester, to more modern iterations like the Fool in King Lear, or the Jester Dagonet in Arthurian legend, the jester has remained a potent archetype in our cultural imagination. He represents the freedom that comes from standing outside society's norms, the insight that can be gained from a tilted perspective on the world. In many ways, the court jester prefigured the role of the satirist, the comedian, and the social critic in our own time. Like the jesters of old, these modern-day fools use humour and wit to challenge authority, to question received wisdom, and to speak truth to power. They remind us of the importance of irreverence in the face of pomp and pretension, and of the need for a critical voice that can cut through the fog of self-importance and self-delusion. As we look back on the long and colourful history of the court jester, we can see in it a reflection of our own society's complex relationship with humour, power, and difference. The jester's tale is one of both cruelty and subversion, oppression and resistance. It speaks to the enduring human need for laughter in the face of adversity, and for the fool's wisdom in a world of folly. And so, as we bid goodnight to the ghosts of the court jesters, let us remember the lesson they embody, that even in the darkest of times, a well-aimed jest can be a powerful weapon against tyranny and injustice. In the face of life's absurdities and tragedies, sometimes the only sane response is to laugh, to don the jester's motley and speak truth to power. And with that thought, dear viewer, we come to the end of our journey through the annals of jester history. I hope you've enjoyed this whimsical romp through the centuries, and that the tales of these colourful characters have brought a smile to your face and a ponder to your thoughts as you drift off to dreamland. If you've made it this far, I suspect you just might be the kind of curious soul who would enjoy more of these meandering explorations of the bygone and the little known. If so, be sure to gently click that like button and softly tap subscribe, so that we may meet again on another drowsy eve to uncover more hidden histories and forgotten tales. Until then, I bid you good night, and may your dreams be filled with the wise fools and merry pranksters of ages past. Adieu.